It is so good to see you guys. I want to say a public thank you to Anita. And really, she had a whole army of volunteers that were here this past week. Now, some of them didn't do much. Some of them kind of hung out in the hospitality room like I did, but there were a lot of other people that did an awful lot. I've got a picture you may have seen on our social media this week, and you can tell it was the first night. As you can tell, sometimes it's kind of like herding cats, but they did a great job, as they always do, keeping it all together. And everybody always wants to know, how many kids were there. And there were a lot of kids, but what I was most impressed with were the number of volunteers. I mean, it was unbelievable how many people gave up a week of their summer to come and be a part of that every night. Many of you guys were there, a lot of you in the crowd. So if that was you, thank you. If it wasn't you, hopefully it'll be you in the future. And that's an important thing we do. Now, if you have your Bible or your phone, I want you to go to Daniel chapter 7. And while you're turning there, I want to ask you a question, and I'm going to need some help on this. And I know, some of you don't like to do this, right? I mean, if I said, hey, raise your hand if you'd like me to give you $1,000, some of you would not raise your hand no matter what. But I've been gone for a couple weeks, so I want you to humor me on this, okay? I want you to raise your hand if you have a favorite movie that you like to go back and occasionally rewatch, a book that you occasionally reread, or a TV show that you find yourself watching even though you've seen every episode multiple times. So if you have a favorite movie that you rewatch, a book you reread, or a TV show that you like to rewatch, I want you to raise your hand, okay? Good. So, all right. Keep your hand up. Just keep them up just for a second. Just want you to know, these are the normal people. According to research, I don't know what that says about the rest of you guys. Maybe you're more sophisticated than us. But according to researchers, most people have at least one movie they like to rewatch, one book they like to reread, or one TV show that they love to catch reruns of. In fact, Netflix just released a survey a few weeks ago in which they discovered that the vast majority of their monthly subscribers now prefer watching shows they've seen before rather than new shows, which has kind of upended their business model. And the question then is, why do we do that? If your time is the most limited commodity you have, why would you spend your limited time watching something you've seen before or rereading a story that you've read before? That's a question that a group of researchers from George Washington University tried to answer. And what they discovered is that while there are secondary reasons, sometimes it's just the nostalgia, that comes with watching the same Christmas movie every year, or maybe it's the familiarity you develop with the characters on your favorite show. By far the biggest reason, though, the reason we watch movies we've seen before and read books that we've read before and watch shows that we've seen before is because we already know how it ends. And more importantly, we know how we feel when it ends. Same thing is true of movie spoilers. Back in 2016, some remember this, there were researchers from the University of California that found that rather than ruining a movie, if you know how it ends in advance, it actually enhances your viewing experience. There's something about knowing the good guys win, the couple falls in love, the mystery gets solved, the bad guy goes to jail, and everybody lives happily ever after. There's just something about knowing that in advance that as you're working your way through the story, it reduces the tension and lowers the anxiety and helps you not to get caught up in the drama of all the different details. Now, I want you to keep that in mind. Turn your attention to Daniel chapter 7. For the last few weeks, we've been in this series working our way through the Old Testament book of Daniel. And up until this point, the story has been pretty straightforward. It's been focused on Daniel and his three friends and how they had to navigate life living in this place, this Babylonian place that was opposed to nearly everything they believed in. But when you transition from chapter 6 into chapter 7, it admittedly starts to get pretty weird. And the reason it gets weird is because all of a sudden you go from talking about what's happened or talking about history to talking about what's going to happen in the future, or what's called prophecy, or sometimes you'll hear it called apocalyptic literature. So all of a sudden, instead of talking about like lions' dens and fiery furnaces, we're confronted with animals that we've never seen before and numbers that are impossible to calculate. Last Sunday night, when I started working on this, I immediately thought, I should have given Austin chapter 7. Like, I should have done the lion's den and let him deal with the apocalypse, because this is some crazy stuff. In Scripture, prophecy always paints a picture of the future. And so in that sense, prophecy is kind of like a movie spoiler. It doesn't give you every detail, but it does give you some things to look for as this drama unfolds, and that's especially true of the second half of the book of Daniel. So remember, as we've gone through this, our goal is not that we learn every detail, and our goal is not just to survive, but to thrive in an environment that's opposed to nearly everything we believe in. So as we jump into this second half, here's the big idea that I want you to take with you today. It's that thriving in the present requires confidence in the future. Thriving in the present requires confidence in the future. So one of the channels that I find myself rewatching over and over again is the SEC Network. And one of the things the SEC Network does in the summer, not much going on in the sports world, so they give each member of the conference gets an entire day in which all of the programming that day is focused on their schools. So like they have a Georgia day, Alabama day, Kentucky day. And so a couple weeks ago, it was Kentucky day. And what they do is the first part of the day, they interview like the current players and the current coaches as kind of a preview of the season that's coming up. And then at night, what they do is they go back and they replay like condensed versions of classic games. So take all the timeouts, all the commercials are out. So it's kind of a shortened version of the game. So a couple weeks ago, I'm sitting there, it's about 10 o'clock at night. The boys are already in bed, and I turn it on, and they're replaying the Kentucky-Florida football game from last season. Now, if you remember the game, Kentucky won that game 33-14. So I thought, I'm going to watch this. I've only watched it like 3 times already, but I'm going to watch it again. So I'm watching it, and there was this period in the third quarter, about 5 or 6 minutes. Kentucky was playing well, but like the wheels came off, right? And they gave up an unbelievable touchdown to Florida. And so I'm watching this, and if you're a Kentucky fan, like I've been my whole life, like when the wheels come off from Kentucky, they really come off. And sometimes those 5 or 6 minute stretches turn into quarters. Those quarters turn into games. And those games turn into like entire decades. So I'm watching this game, and I realized though, like I didn't get mad about it. You know what I'm saying? I didn't yell at the TV. I didn't change the channel. I didn't get up and walk around and say, I knew they were going to. Because I already knew the score, I was able to watch the game without getting all upset. Because I had confidence in the future, I was able to enjoy the present. And the same thing is what Daniel's trying to accomplish in Daniel chapter 7. That's what biblical prophecy is about. Even though you might not understand every detail, you might not remember every single plot twist, as long as you know how the story ends, you're better able to enjoy the ride. And so as Daniel 7 opens, Daniel has this dream that's kind of a remake of a dream he already had back in Daniel chapter 2. And just as a side note, if you've been tracking with us, the timeline of Daniel's life gets really confusing. If you were here last weekend, Austin told you that in Daniel chapter 6, Daniel's like 80-something years old, and he's been in Babylon now for 60 years, and he just sort of lived his life. In Daniel chapter 7, he's actually looking back at something that happened when he was in his early 60s. So as we launch into this, you read this and you see the name Belshazzar, and you think, like, I thought he was dead. You're right. It's just that Daniel's looking back. So here's the scene. Daniel's in his 60s. For 40 years, he's been in Babylon. He's been climbing the bureaucratic ladder. He's been using his unique gifts in the place where God had placed him to try to make things better for the people around him. It's then that he has this dream in which God gives him what I'm calling a brief history of the future. Now, he doesn't tell him everything that's going to happen. He doesn't spell out every detail, but he does tell him 4 things that are going to happen between this point in Daniel's life and the end of time, whenever that may come. So if you're tracking with us, here's the first thing that God tells Daniel is going to happen. He said, there will be a succession of world empires. Daniel chapter 7, verse 1. In the first year of Belshazzar, king of Babylon, Daniel had a dream, and visions passed through his mind as he was lying in bed. He wrote down the substance of his dream. Daniel said, in my vision at night I looked, and there before me were the four winds of heaven, churning up the great sea. Four great beasts, each different from the others, came up out of the sea. Let me stop there just a second, especially in the Old Testament. Anytime you read anything about the sea or the ocean, it's always pictured as something chaotic and dangerous. Now, in our culture, we hear that and we have visions of like, everybody's wearing matching outfits on their last night at the beach and we're lining up for pictures. This is not that. This is something that's dangerous. This is something that's chaotic. And it's out of that chaos that these four beasts, what he calls, and he's going to go on to describe them as animals that you've never seen before, they emerge. Look at verse 4. The first was like a lion, and it had the wings of an eagle. I watched until its wings were torn off, and it was lifted from the ground so that it stood on 2 feet like a human being, and the mind of a human was given to it. And there before me was a second beast, which looked like a bear. It was raised up on one of its sides and had 3 ribs in its mouth between its teeth. It was told, get up and eat your fill of flesh. After that, I looked, and there before me was another beast, one that looked like a leopard. And on its back, it had 4 wings like those of a bird. This beast had 4 heads, and it was given authority to rule. After that, in my vision, I looked, and there before me was a 4th beast, terrifying and frightening and very powerful. It had large iron teeth. It crushed and devoured its victims and trampled underfoot whatever was left. It was different from all the former beasts, and it had 10 horns. Now, if any of that sounds familiar, if you were here when we talked about Daniel chapter 2, we talked about this weird statue in which each different part of the statue represents a different world empire that sort of collided during Daniel's time on earth. And this is just a remake of that. So here's a chart I made that hopefully will help you make sense of this. We're going to put it on the screen. The way most scholars understand this, the golden head of the statue and the winged lion both represent the Babylonian Empire. The silver chest and the bear represent the Medo-Persian Empire, which overtook the Babylonians. Then you have the bronze belly and the leopard, which represents the Greek Empire, which was led by Alexander the Great. And the reason it's represented by a leopard, if you remember history, Alexander the Great conquered the world from Egypt all the way to India in just 10 years. There's never been anything like it in history. And then finally have the iron legs on the beast and this 10 horn on the statue, and this 10-horned beast with like iron teeth, and that's a picture of the Roman Empire. Now, if you're a person who's really into prophecy, and I know some people are, then you know that this is one of those sections where people love to debate all the details, and they try to flesh out exactly what every single thing in this passage means. Just tell you, I think that's a perfect example of like missing the forest because you're arguing about the color of the leaves and how many rings are on each tree. Like, this is not designed to be a picture of every single thing that's ever going to happen. The primary point in this dream is that no matter how big these empires become, no matter how powerful they appear, no matter how much they expand, they're all incredibly temporary. Every single kingdom, every single empire will eventually crumble. Every king will eventually be deposed. Every military will eventually be defeated. Every count will eventually be emptied. And just so there's no mistake, like the same thing that's true of all of those historical empires is true of the empires today. And it's also true of like the empire that you're building. One thing that's so cool about Daniel, you read through, because of his longevity in Babylon, he became super close to 4 different world leaders. First there was Nebuchadnezzar. Then Nebuchadnezzar gets overthrown, and it's Darius. Then Darius gets overthrown, and it's Belshazzar. Then Belshazzar gets overthrown. There's this guy named Cyrus. And here's what I want you to understand. During the time that Daniel was connected to all these people, like each one of those guys was the most powerful, most well-known, most famous person in the world. I mean, they were literally sitting on top of the world. They were the top of the pyramid. There was nobody that compared to them. They were all almost completely invincible, except they weren't. Because what happened to them, the same thing that eventually happens to all of us. And that's that their empires crumbled and they were replaced by somebody else. And what God wanted Daniel to know, and by extension what Daniel wanted us to know, is that that's the way it always works. And that's the way it's going to work until the end of time. Now here's the second thing you learn in this passage, is that evil will continue to grow, culminating with the arrival of a mysterious figure known as the Antichrist. So you get to verse 7. Daniel describes this fourth beast that has iron teeth and 10 horns. I said most historians believe that's the Roman Empire, and the 10 horns represent the 10 states that the Roman Empire eventually divided up into. But one of the things I hope you notice as we read through this is like none of these empires are pictured as being innocent and benevolent. You know what I'm saying? It's not like they're not pictured by cuddly puppies and ponies. I mean, it's the stuff that nightmares are made of, right? A leopard with 4 heads, a lion that has wings, this sort of hybrid animal with iron teeth. I mean, this is not something that's pictured as being calm and peaceful and serene. And if you're a person who's into history, you know that same pattern that Daniel saw in his dream has continued right up until today. I mean, you go back through history, it's the story of one empire after another trying to take over the world. You had the Mongols, the Ottomans, Napoleon's French Empire, Hitler's Third Reich, Stalin's Soviet Empire, Chairman Mao's Red China, the Islamic Caliphate. I mean, it is just one empire after another seeking to take over the world. Daniel says that's how it's always been, and that's how it'll always be. But then in verse 8, he sees something that interrupts that process. Look at verse 8. While I was thinking about the horns, there before me was another horn, a little one, which came up among them, and 3 of the first horns were uprooted before it. This horn had eyes like the eyes of a human being, and a mouth that spoke boastfully. Now, this is the first time in Scripture that this mysterious figure known as the Antichrist is mentioned. Later in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, the Apostle Paul, talking about the same person, calls him the lawless one and says this. He says, he will oppose and exalt himself over everything that is called God or is worship, so that he sets himself up in God's temple, proclaiming himself to be God. So the Bible teaches that while there have been many antichrists throughout history, before the end, there'll be some kind of like ultimate antichrist or final antichrist who will wreak havoc throughout the world. Now, I'll be honest with you. When it comes to the antichrist, I've got a lot more questions than I've got answers. And most people do too. But I've been doing this long enough to know that anytime you talk about this, especially in an election year, everybody just assumes that the person they're voting against is the most likely person to be the Antichrist. And so as soon as you read this, some of you thought, you know what? That sounds like Joe Biden. Other people read that could be Donald Trump. And some of you are like, yes, finally we're getting somewhere. Well, I'm not going to tell you who it is because I don't know. But throughout history, there have been a lot of different people that have been identified as potential antichrists. But however all that plays out, here's what we know for sure. As the world gets darker, the Antichrist will exert increasing influence. So the very next chapter, Daniel 8, Daniel has this another dream, another vision, and he learns more about this mysterious person. Here's the way he describes him in Daniel 8. He says, in the latter part of their reign, when rebels have become completely wicked, a fierce-looking king, a master of intrigue will arise. He will become very strong, but not by his own power. There'll be this evil behind him. He will cause astounding devastation and will succeed in whatever he does. He will destroy those who are mighty, the holy people. He will cause deceit to prosper, and he will consider himself superior. When they feel secure, he will destroy and take his stand against the Prince of Princes. Yet, don't miss this part, yet he will be destroyed, but not by human power. So you have this picture of this person who declares war on God and on the people of God. And as this evil increases, he will emerge on the scene, and it'll look for a while as if he's invincible, as if he cannot be stopped, but it won't last. He'll eventually be stopped. He'll eventually be destroyed. And the reason he'll eventually be destroyed is because of what happens in verse 9. And this is what I really wanted to get to. Listen to this, what Daniel saw in his dream. As I looked, thrones were set in place, and the Ancient of Days took his seat. His clothing was as white as snow. The hair of his head was white like wool. His throne was flaming with fire, and its wheels were ablaze. A river of fire was flowing, coming out from before him. Thousands upon thousands attended him. 10,000 times 10,000, which is the highest number they had in the Hebrew language, stood before him. The court was seated, and the books were opened. Then I continued to watch because of the boastful words the horn was speaking. I kept looking until the beast was slain and its body destroyed and thrown into the blazing fire. The other beasts had been stripped of their authority, but they were allowed to live a period of time. Here's a third thing I want you to catch from this. No matter what happens, God will ultimately defeat the Antichrist. Now, I don't know how it's all going to play out. I don't know how it's all going to look, but we do have the promise of victory. So you have this craziness on the world. You have this chaos taking place. The world's growing darker. It feels as if things are spinning out of control. And then all of a sudden there's this scene change in which these thrones are set in place. God himself takes his seat. This passage calls him the Ancient of Days, and he brings calm into the chaos. And I love that name, the Ancient of Days. It's a clear indication. Yeah, empires come and go. Political leaders come and go. Presidents come and go. Kings come and go. Militaries come and go. But there is one who has always been there and who will always be there, who will ultimately have the final say. One of the most popular TV series over the last few years, a lot of people go back and rewatch, is the show Game of Thrones. I've got a picture from the season. So I'm not telling you to watch this, right? Like, so don't go home and be like, preacher said to watch. I'm not saying that. I've never seen it, but my understanding is it can be pretty rough. So if you're a fan of this, when we have the invitation, we'll expect you to come forward. It was adapted from a book written by George R.R. Martin. The book sort of had a cult following for a long time, and then it broke into the mainstream with the TV show. But the main storyline is there are these 7 kingdoms that have all been united under one king, Robert Baratheon. That's him sitting on the throne. Well, then he dies, and there's this war that breaks out between all these different members of the royal family, all these different groups, all trying to ascend his throne, which is known as the Iron Throne. And fans of the show, and I read about this, will tell you that it gets pretty dark in terms of how far people are willing to go to get what they want. There's a famous quote in the show from the queen of the Iron Kingdom. Her name is Cersei Lannister. Here's what she said. She said, when you play the Game of Thrones, you win or you die. There's no middle ground. Honestly, that's kind of the story of history right there. Like, there are winners and there are losers and there are kings and there are commoners, and everybody's fighting for their chance to sit on the throne. And to be honest, I mean, that's the story of your life and my life. We're all playing some version of this Game of Thrones. But here's the deal. What Daniel discovered, and what every single person eventually discovers, including whoever the Antichrist might be, is that ultimately there's only one throne. and you're not on it. And neither is the Antichrist. It belongs exclusively to the Ancient of Days. And anytime that I try to sit in his seat, which is not my seat, and anytime you try to sit in his seat, which is not your seat, things begin to unravel, chaos comes, and eventually people die. And if you were to go around the room, we could all tell our own stories of when we tried to sit in his seat. We tried to ascend the throne of our own hearts, only to have to watch as everything around us begin to crumble. Maybe your business went bankrupt, maybe your family fell apart, maybe your relationship with your friends went haywire, all because you tried to sit in a seat on a throne that didn't belong to you. And anytime I try to sit in God's seat, bad things happen. But the good news is that even when things feel like they're unraveling, God is still at work, because God is always ultimately on his throne. And so you read through Daniel, it's easy to look back at the book of Daniel, and you can see how even as it seemed like things were spiraling out of control, God was working behind the scenes to accomplish his purpose. For example, when the Persians come in and they conquer the Babylonians, you just think, okay, Daniel's worked for the Babylonians, he's out. But that's not what happened. Instead, he gets promoted, and he convinces the Persians to finance the rebuilding of Jerusalem, including the temple that had been destroyed. Then eventually the Persians move off the scene. They're overtaken by the Greeks. And what do the Greeks do? They conquer the known world, and they combine the world under one language, which becomes the language that the New Testament was written in later. Then the Greeks pass off the scene. Here come the Romans, and what do the Romans do? The Romans build this interstate system, the first sort of road system throughout the ancient world, so that when Jesus comes along, he sends the apostles out, and they can travel down these roads. They can go anywhere they want to go in the empire, and they can communicate with anybody they want to communicate with, because everybody already speaks the same language. And all of a sudden, you have these little outposts of the kingdom, these little churches that start to pop up. And all of that was done because God was working behind the scenes. So when it seemed like everything was falling apart, guess what was happening? Everything was actually coming together. And that leads to the last thing I want you to see in this passage. And it's that Jesus will ultimately rule throughout eternity. Check out verse 13. In my vision at night I looked, and there before me was one like a son of man. Coming with the clouds of heaven, he approached the Ancient of Days and was led into his presence. He was given authority, glory, and sovereign power. All nations and peoples of every language worshiped him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion that will not pass away, and his kingdom is one that will never be destroyed. I, Daniel, was troubled in spirit, and the visions that passed through my mind disturbed me. I approached one of those standing there and asked him the meaning of all this. So he told me and gave me the interpretation of things. The four great beasts are four kings that will rise from the earth, but the holy people of the Most High will receive the kingdom and will possess it forever. Yes, forever and ever. One writer I read this week called this the secret of history. So one day in the future, time is going to end. God is going to sit on his throne. He's going to open these books, and he's going to judge the nations, and then he's going to hand the keys to the kingdom to his son, who this passage calls the Son of Man, which becomes the most frequent way that Jesus refers to himself in the New Testament. And his son, the Son of Man, Jesus, will rule throughout eternity, and rather than having a temporary empire like every other world empire that's come before, his will be an eternal empire. To borrow Paul's words from Philippians, he said, therefore God exalted him, talking about Jesus, to the highest place and gave him the name that's above every other name, so that at the name of Jesus every knee would bow in heaven and on earth and under the earth, and every tongue will acknowledge that Jesus Christ is Lord. And when you know that, it may not keep you from experiencing pain, but it should keep you from experiencing panic. Because if you know how the story ends, you don't have to get caught up in all the drama of the details. I have one last picture I want to show you. One of the movies that my boys really enjoyed last year that I anticipate they will rewatch numerous times over the next few years was the Super Mario Brothers movie. Now, when I was a kid, Mario and Luigi were video game characters. Now they're movie stars, right? Which shows you anything is possible. So here are these guys, and if you remember, this was like the most highly anticipated movie release of last year. What you may not remember, though, is 2 weeks before the release of the movie, somebody got a pirated copy of the entire movie, and they uploaded it to social media. People started watching it, they started sharing it, and before the moderators could get it taken down, it had over 10 million views in just a matter of hours. And so you would think, like, that would ruin the movie, right? If 10 million people have already seen it. In fact, the day after that happened, there were two prominent film critics who published reviews of the movie that told how it ended in newspapers 2 weeks before it came out. And you would think, like, nobody's going to go see a movie that you can just open the paper and see how it is. But if you remember, that's not what happened. When it finally hit the theaters, people just flooded in to see it. It had the biggest worldwide opening weekend in history and became the number one highest rated movie based on a video game. It was one of two movies last year that took in over $1 billion. The only other competitor for that was the Barbie movie. And I'm not sure what that says about us, but that's where we are. So here's the question. Why would so many people spend their limited time and their hard-earned money to go see a movie that they already knew how it ended? It goes back to what we said earlier. If it's a happy ending, you don't mind reliving it. And that's what Daniel 7's about. I want you to stand with us. As we close today, I want to make sure you understand the most important thing about Daniel, about Matthew 24, about Revelation, all the passages everybody gets obsessed with. The most important thing is not that you know every detail. It's not that you know what each symbol represents. It's not that you can write out your chart and explain all this. The most important thing is that you know that one day in the future, history's going to end, God is going to sit on his throne, we're all going to face judgment, and Jesus is going to rule throughout eternity. And so here's your option. It says over and over again, both in Daniel and Revelation, Paul said in Philippians, that every knee is going to bow. No exceptions. So if you know that, you can either do that in advance, in recognition of what's going to happen, in recognition of God's authority over you, or you can wait till like you get to that moment when it'll be too late to matter. But either way, I mean, it's up to you. You can either do it now, or you can do it later. But if you want to have confidence in the future, you do it now. So if you're here this morning and you don't have that confidence in your future, you're not sure where you stand spiritually, you have questions about what it would look like for you, or maybe you're here and you're ready to make a public decision to follow Christ, we'd be glad to help you. We're going to sing a couple songs. If you need to talk to somebody or pray with somebody, meet me on this front row.